All right, so I think we should get started, and I'm very pleased to introduce Carmen Ramos, who is going to be giving the talk today, and she's a curator for Latino art at the American Art Museum, which is one of the museums in the huge Smithsonian complex. And she is an expert, or she is a specialist in Latino and Latin American art history. She got her PhD in art history from the University of Chicago, writing a dissertation of the Cuban painter of do I have that? Yeah, her dissertation was called "A Painter of Cuban Life, Victor Patricio de Landaluz and 19th Century Cuban Politics," and she has also organized many and diverse exhibitions, and I would like to mention a couple of them. For example, Blackout, a Centennial Commission by which is was installed at the museum in New Jersey, and she has been also the curator of the 5th biennial at El Museo del Barrio in New York City. Finally, she has recently organized Our America, the Latino Presence in American Art, which is on view at the American Art Museum until March 2nd of this year. So I encourage everybody here to go and see it, because it's a major exhibition of Latino art based on the collections of the Museum of American Art, and then we'll be traveling to other places. So, without any further ado, I would like to let Carmen.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to speak here at the University of Maryland. I know it's a very respected institution, both nationally and locally, and that it has produced a lot of art historians that have had an impact on American art. My talk today will focus on this exhibition that I curated, and which, as the doctor said, is still on view at the museum through March the 2nd, and I hope that my talk will encourage you to see the exhibition, and you can judge for yourself and see things in person. I have a prepared lecture which I'll present. I wish there were more people, but this would be good for it to be taped and for your students to use. Okay. Up until the mid-20th century, it was common for scholars of American art to pose a question to the likes of, what is American about American art? Answering this question allowed early Americanists like Lloyd Goodrich, the former director of the Whitney Museum of American Art, to self-define the unique cultural milieu of a former European colony and to pose their ideas about the common denominators that united American artists. For contemporary curators and scholars, this question is now utterly passé, for few believe in the existence of an unchanging of a set of unchanging American characteristics in the visual arts. The title of my talk, What is Latino about American Art, harks back to this past, not only because this question has rarely been asked, but because the juxtaposition of Latino and American exposes a gap in the ways in which we traditionally think about our national culture. As the first named curator for Latino art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, to be charged with the serious task of expanding and interpreting the museum's pioneering collection of Latino art, I constantly return to this relationship and ask myself, what are my and our institutional goals? In building our Latino collection and organizing exhibitions to interpret it, are we trying to define the essence of Latino culture? Is it even possible to singularly crystallize the expansive field of Latino art, which comprises works by artists who are native-born citizens, immigrants, descendants of incorporated populations, exiles, or, as Latinos are more routinely called, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, Dominican Americans, and beyond? As I set about my task, I consciously sought to capture the expansiveness of the field, not only in terms of the varied cultural backgrounds of Latino artists, but also their sprawling aesthetic and conceptual range. The sampling of works gathered in Our America are a testament to the unbounded nature of the field. It reveals that Latino art can encompass. The deceivingly straightforward works of Carmen that document and reflect upon Chicano daily life. The activist and formally compelling graphics of Juan Sanchez that confront the ambiguous political status of Puerto Rico. The avant-garde performances and media interventions of the conceptual group ASCO. The romantic melancholy of Eliana Garcia's photographs that suggest the emotional ties that bind an immigrant to her native country of birth. And the spare sculptures of Jesse Amado, which engage the legacy of minimalism from what the artist considers a personal perspective. Ever aware that permanent collections define the parameters of a given field, I knew I didn't want to build a collection or organize an exhibition that emphasized a narrow concept or that packaged Latino art into a neat little category. Rather, my goal was to highlight a critical perspective on Latino art, a field whose most salient common denominator is that it's often not integrated into the narrative of American art. My deliberate purpose was to stake a fundamental yet ambitious claim for Latino art right here in the nation's capital. While the Smithsonian as a whole has global collections and initiatives, it is also an eminently national institution whose efforts are wedded to notions of our collective national patrimony. The Smithsonian American Art Museum in particular is not just any museum, it's the National Museum, and taken at face value, this idea can conjure the narrowest or most inclusive expectations of what should be housed within its walls. I've asked myself this question many times: how best to frame Latino art in this hallowed national context? These observations led me to ponder both the roots of the category of Latino art, as well as popular conceptions about our national culture. Historically speaking, Latino art in related terms emerged in the late 1960s through the 1980s as political statements and as terms of solidarity uniting artists of related cultural and historical experiences against the exclusionary practices of American cultural institutions. For instance, during this period in New York, artists began to advocate for the greater representation of works by African American, Latino, and women artists in the collections and exhibitions of major American museums. It is within these contexts that terms like Black and Puerto Rican art, and by extension Latino art, came to reference not only rich fields of cultural production, but also underrepresented facets within the category of American art. I also considered that in the United States, we commonly critique notions of ethnic identity for being restrictive, and wondered whether we do enough to question what counts as American and who is considered an American artist. This is an important question for a field with a plethora of museums and publications that bear its name. When we ask these questions, it becomes clear that the history of American art, as told through museum collections, exhibitions, and key texts, remains deficient of Latino participants and protagonists. And this is not just my opinion, but a proven fact. In 2003, the Chicano Research Studies Center at UCLA conducted a survey of citations for Latino artists by looking at the art historical databases and textbooks we and students use as a basis for research in the field. They found and clearly documented that despite their extensive and distinguished careers, Latino artists are woefully left out or superficially integrated into the art historical scholarship. For these and other reasons, the exhibition Our America embarks from the simple assertion that Latino art is an integral part of the art of the United States. This declaration is not meant to deny the transnational nature of Latino art that bounds it to the culture and history of Latin America. It does not seek to downplay the disruptive undercurrent of much Latino art that opposes singular views of American culture. It also does not advocate that we return to a closed vision of national culture that disregards past and present global realities. Rather, it calls attention to the underemphasized and rich connections between Latino art and the national context in which it was born. On the one hand, the affirmation that Latino art is American art is simply a fact. Latino artists are American by birth, citizenship, residence, education, and even sacrifice, a factor made clear by the large number of artists that have served in the U.S. Armed Forces. On the other hand, The statement poses a challenge to the ways in which we traditionally think about what constitutes American culture. Our America urges that we not only affirm Latino art as American art, but that we ask and answer how and to what effect it is part of this national category. Taking this step requires that we see Latino artists not as isolated figures solely embroiled in an intergroup conversation amongst themselves, but as peers, dialoguing with other American artists and their national context. When positioned in this national night, it becomes clear that Latino artists shape and participate in the artistic movements of their day, tackle questions and themes tied to American national identity, and probe our popular culture often, but not exclusively, from the perspective of Latino experience. In fact, there are many individual Latino artists who worked alongside their American peers well before the category of Latino art was established, yet their careers remain absent from the annals of American art. Painters such as the Cuban-born Carmen, for example, produced abstract works in keeping with her times. Romero moved to the United States in 1939, and following a sojourn in Paris, she returned permanently to the United States to become a participant in the New York avant-garde. Her geometric abstractions, marked by bold, angular forms piercing through space, would anticipate the later developments of hard-edge minimalism in op art. During the 1950s and after, Romero befriended some of the leading post-war abstractionists, such as Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman. By including Herrera's works in our collection, we are finally able to stage what may be the first real-time museum encounter between her work and that of her US-based peers, like Ellsworth Kelly, another American artist who was drawn to Paris after World War II and who created non-objective two-color compositions like the one seen here. Puerto Rican-born Olga Albizu, on the other hand, first embraced abstraction on the island and then continued in New York, where she studied with Hans Hofmann, the German emigre artist who had a decisive impact on mid-century American art. In joyous works like Radiante, Albizu worked with a handful of colors in a single canvas to orchestrate what she called a conversation between color and form. Her intense color palette conveys that, like other abstract expressionists, she believed in the emotive power of color. Albizu's works are anonymously recognized worldwide, since her canvases grace the covers of several jazz albums, including the bossa nova classic Gas Gilberto. Yet she too is not incorporated into the history of mid-century American art, outside of the histories of Puerto Rican art. A great deal of my collecting efforts have focused on artists like Herrera and Albizu, who worked in the post-World War II era. While this is not the beginning of Latino art, it is at this historical juncture that Latino art starts to bubble up, first through specific categories such as Mexican American and Puerto Rican, and increasingly through the umbrella category of Latino. This naming happens for at least two reasons. One, it is during the mid-century period that Latino artists are increasingly educated at American art schools. And two, in part motivated by Latino service in the military during and after World War II, Latino communities began to question their marginalized position in American society, as well as the prevailing melting pot discourses that shaped our vision of American culture. My research reveals that in many cases, these factors started to merge, and that Latino artists began to inflect art movements and themes of American national identity with perspectives drawn from Latino experience. You see this kind of merging in El Tamalito del Hoyo, an early painting by Roberto Chavez that pictures a young boy from his own Los Angeles neighborhood. After his military service in the Korean War and with funds made possible by the GI Bill, Chavez studied art at UCLA and eventually helped launch a brand of expressionistic painting associated with Los Angeles in the early 1960s. In early works, Chavez used this style to animate his portraits, some of which captured Mexican-American subjects, like this young boy named Tamalito. Chavez depicts his subject wearing high waters, army surplus boots, and donning a grayish skin tone similar to the concrete sidewalk upon which he stands. Tightly caught between the top and bottom edges of the canvas, El Tamalito, with his big eyes and round cheeks, conveys the innocence of youth, whereas his ambiance, complete with graffiti scrawled over walls, suggests a specific time and place. Behind him, a dilapidated structure with white picket fence counters the hope of the American suburban dream we so associate with the decade of the 1950s. The painting at once communicates the individual personality of the young boy, as well as the social conditions in which he lived. While artists like Chavez depicted people and places from their own immediate environment, other Latino artists delved into the annals of national history to create works that question established versions of American history, especially events that have shaped the Latino experience. Many Latino artists are drawn to the 19th century, a period that witnessed American Western expansion across the continent and the rise of the United States as an imperial power. The appropriation of lands following the Mexican-American War not only advanced the goals of Manifest Destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to control most of North America, it also converted residents of Mexico's northern frontier into American citizens overnight. Even though their status as citizens was ratified as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, the experience of Mexican-turned-American populations in the Southwest runs counter to their new citizenship. Historian Vicky Ruiz has summarized that, quote, Mexicans on the U.S. side of the border became second-class citizens, commonly divested of their property, political power, and cultural entitlements, unquote. For these and other reasons, many historians mark the moment of westward expansion as the beginning of the Mexican-American community, a history that remains marginalized even in revisionist accounts of the West. Artistically speaking, Western expansion was visualized through extensive photographic portfolios by artists such as William H. Jackson, who captured majestic vistas of recently acquired lands that largely excluded traces of earlier residents in the region in favor of works that depict an empty frontier waiting to be inhabited, tamed, and developed. In Jackson's photograph, only the title of the work, which includes the word cañón, complete with the Spanish letter ñ, suggests these earlier residents and history. Contemporary landscapes by photographer Delilah Montoya contest these empty historic scenes to tackle the myth of the West. Taken on the border between Arizona and Mexico in 2004, her photographs themselves resort to empty landscapes, yet they too suggest the trace of another history. Montoya's works initially began as an effort to raise awareness about the humanitarian crisis along the U.S.-Mexico border. This photograph captures the activities of Humane Borders, a nonprofit group that legally places water tanks along the desert to prevent migrant deaths from dehydration. As the project unfolded, Montoya became increasingly aware of the complexity of life in the region. In Desire Line's Babacavari Peak, Arizona, she shot a view on the Tejano Reservation, whose lands and people are divided between the state of Arizona and the Sonora region of Mexico. Sonora-based Tejano peoples become border crossers when attempting to enter their ancestral homeland. Montoya worked closely with one tribal member, seen on the left, who scatters water jugs along the reservation's border. In the distance, the hazy outline of the Babacavari Mountains, the site of Tejano creation myths, attests to the history embedded in this land. In a region so historically and politically complex, clear notions of native, migrant, insider, and outsider are morally difficult to navigate. Puerto Rican artists working on both the island and mainland have similarly explored the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, a connection that was also cemented in the 19th century. Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory at the end of the so-called Spanish-American War of 1898, when the island was ceded to the United States by Spain. Since then, the relationship between the island and the United States grew increasingly complex and negotiated through several congressional acts that established the island's ambiguous political status as an unincorporated territory that is now considered a freely associated state or commonwealth. Since 1917, Puerto Ricans are born American citizens, yet island residents cannot vote in federal elections. Over the course of her lengthy career, Mira Baez has examined Puerto Rico's unique landscape to affirm the island's independent political identity. In Platanal, she focuses her gaze on a field of plantain trees, a crop that since the Spanish colonial period has been wedded to concepts of Puerto Rican sovereignty. A key accoutrement of the Jíbaro, or Puerto Rican peasant, the plantain appears in iconic paintings such as Our Daily Bread by Ramon, which depicts a humble farmer whose straw hat functions like a halo. Rather than focus on the plantain as the daily bread that literally sustains island residents, Baez deploys the icon to assert a sense of place that she can appreciate as an island insider. Baez relishes in the surface beauty of the plantain leaves as they reflect the tropical sun, and delights in her use of paint on an unframed canvas. In the end, Baez displays a willful intent to look, depict, and therefore possess the land on her own terms. These examples reveal that Latino artists not only mold canonical genres like the landscape to open up marginalized chapters in our national history, they also engage historical events from the Mexican-American War to the Spanish-American War and beyond that paved the way toward the establishment of immigrant and migrant Latino communities in the continental United States. The idea that we are a nation of immigrants, to use the title of President Kennedy's 1963 book on the subject, is a foundational and complex pillar of our national imaginary. As many of us know, there are exceptions to this truism, which includes Native Americans, African slaves and their descendants, and as we've already explored, incorporated Mexican and Puerto Rican populations. Despite the fact that the majority of Americans have immigrant roots, it is uncommon to find studies in American art that engage this subject head-on. Here too, there are exceptions, like the Golden Door, which was a major exhibition, which was the first major exhibition to explore the work of immigrants who arrived as artists in the United States or who became artists as they matured into adulthood. This exhibition included works by Joseph Stella, the first so-called Italian-American artist, whose ambitious canvases like Brooklyn Bridge married the scale and arch compositions of Italian altarpieces with the modernity of New York. The Golden Door exhibition often recounted the harrowing personal experiences of artists who arrived amidst political and social turmoil in Europe, yet didn't necessarily present their work as bicultural. The subject of immigration, therefore, remains a ubiquitous yet invisible topic within American art history. Latino artists, on the other hand, directly engage the subject of immigration and migration, its social, historical, and political causes, as well as its impact on individuals and communities. In part, this stems from the fact that Latino artists emigrated in an era marked by technological advancements, from the telephone to airline travel to the World Wide Web, that allows individuals to stay linked to their culture of origin in a way that simply was not possible in the past. They are also attracted to this subject because for many, their own resettlement is recent history. To use the terms of sociology, many Latino artists are first-generation Americans, or 1.5ers, a phrase that refers to those who emigrate as adolescents. Cuban American artists like Maria Brito and Arturo Rodriguez fit into this 1.5 category. They emigrated to the United States in their teens in the wake of the 1959 Cuban Revolution that prompted the exodus of thousands of Cubans who did not support the government of Fidel Castro. For these artists, immigration has meant exile, or being severed against your will from your native country of birth. These artists often turn to allegorical or surreal imagery to conjure the emotional and psychological rupture of migration. Brito's large assemblage in the Patio de mi Casa powerfully juxtaposes the past and the present. On the one side, a cradle nestles a planter holding a small tree with exposed roots. On the other, the artist palpably recreated her humble kitchen, complete with personal mementos like photographs and symbolic objects like a face mask that looks like a layer of peeled skin. Both sides contained references to water, plants, and nature, suggesting the possibility of spiritual renewal through the passage of time. These and other works convey that Latino artists are not only driven to make visible the specificities of their migration stories, but that they wrestle with finding the appropriate artistic strategies to explore the subject on the level of content and form. In her quest to penetrate the Dominican American experience, Sheresade turns to drawing, a medium conducive to spontaneously capturing the willful yet fragile motivations that spur migration. Her lushly combined paintings and drawings, populated by mestizo figures, which the artist considers archetypes of the people of the Americas, are often informed by her interactions with Dominican Yorkers, or Dominicans from New York. Melting planes swirling in the air and explosions of fine line drawings imply ideas in formation and the brave drive to step out and leave your mark on the world. To depict Puerto Rican migrant laborers, Antonio Martorell himself resorts to the laborious technique of woodblock carving. His large-scale tar beach prints were inspired by historic photographs, snapshots of Puerto Rican migrants, either laboring in factories or working or taking a respite in New York City's tar beaches, the rooftops of tenement buildings. In merging these two sources, the artist captured the lives of anonymous Puerto Rican laborers who fueled the U.S. economy and supported relatives on the island, often mailing back home their Sunday best rooftop portraits as evidence of their economic betterment. In Tar Beach 1, a fashionable woman wears a fur-colored coat and sits in front of a New York City skyline. Her hard-working double sits to her left, completely engrossed in her job as a seamstress. For other artists, their own migration leads them to open up history and explore the global flows of people and cultures that have traversed the Americas since European colonization. For Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, seen here on the left in the 1994 performance, her migration to the United States brought her into contact with African American artists who challenged conventional representations of Black culture. As she settled in a country with its own African diaspora community, Campos Pons increasingly began to see herself as part of a global African diaspora. Her anguished separation from Cuba additionally started to resonate with the historic break between Africa and its dispersed descendants in the Americas. Constellation, the work in our collection seen on the right, comes from an ambitious Polaroid series that references Blackness in an evocative way. 16 photographs arranged in a grid presents fragments of the artist's hair against painted environments that evoke the sky, a body of water, or a map. The central 4 panels depict her head from above, and the surrounding photographs record locks or balls of hair at different ranges of proximity and distance. Here, Campos Pons takes an often malign marker of African ancestry, black hair, and turns it into a metaphor for cultural resilience. Like a constellation in the sky, viewers can see the whole composition and its individual parts, an idea that resonates with the dispersed yet culturally connected links that bind the African diaspora. Dreamlike and visually fractured, the work evokes the rupture of slavery and exile and the ability of the imagination to bridge the gaps of time and space. It was, however, the tumultuous historical period of the 1960s and early 70s, what we now consider the Civil Rights era, that drew Latino artists decisively into the American political and cultural sphere. The massive mobilizations for equity and social justice were a response to the African American Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war, labor, and international student movements, all of which spurred the quest for civil rights. Galvanized by the times in which they lived, Latino artists became masters of socially engaged art, challenging what many considered the social detachment of reigning American art movements. Latino artists reinvigorated mural and graphic traditions in an effort to reach ordinary people where they lived and worked. In this way, Latino artists not only chronicled a turning point in American history, they actively shaped history. For many, the activism of the United Farm Workers was an important point of departure. Emmanuel Martinez, for example, created the altar upon which Cesar Chavez broke his highly publicized 25-day fast in 1968. Like this ceremonial object, many of the posters in our collection have a specific story behind them. In 1973, Javier Viramontes created this poster in support of the United Farm Workers Union. That year, Chavez had initiated a new great boycott in reaction to the violent intervention of the Teamsters in the California labor struggle. Esther Hernandez's masterful Sun Mad energized the critique of hazardous labor conditions among farm workers by merging the recognizable sun-made logo with the Mexican calavera, an icon grounded in Mesoamerican culture, popular tradition, and the visual satire of the Mexican artist José Guadalupe Posada. Younger artists like Margarita Cabrera have taken the theme of labor that emerged so strongly during the Civil Rights era in directions responsive to our changing times. Her soft sculptures, which take on the appearance of toasters, blenders, and other domestic objects, began with her discovery that many of the appliances used in American homes were assembled in maquiladora factories or assemblage plants located across the US-Mexico border. Unlike the pristine new objects sold to the American consumer, Cabrera's life-size replicas of common appliances bear the trace of her own laborious process. In lieu of the plastic components that are manufactured in Mexico, Cabrera uses vinyl, a synthetic project that also resembles skin. Their languid shapes sag as if they're about to collapse under their own weight. Cabrera's anthropomorphized sculptures reference Mexican labor that ironically supports middle-class lifestyles in the United States. Rather than focus on the plight of the domestic factory worker, a dwindling figure in a society where practically all goods are made in China, Korea, Mexico, or elsewhere, Cabrera shifts her attention to the US consumer who purchases products manufactured under harsh working conditions. As these examples reveal, Latino artists participate in a major thematic thread in American art: labor. From images of toiling slaves and sharecroppers in 19th century painting to depictions of the heroic worker in Depression-era art, labor has been an ongoing subject in the history of American art. Working on behalf of civil rights, Latino artists, however, sought to disrupt rather than uphold the status quo. They not only represented laboring peoples, but sought to galvanize them and the public to take political action. Even as Latino artists were active during the Civil Rights era, they've continued to create works since then that reflect on this period as a turning point in American society. In the 1980s, Frank Romero turned to the death of Ruben Salazar, an event that galvanized the Chicano community to continue to press on for their civil and human rights. Salazar was an accomplished Los Angeles Times journalist who chronicled the rise of the Chicano civil rights movement. His celebrated essay, What is a Chicano and what is it that the Chicanos want, was one of the first to redefine the term Chicano as a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself. On August 29, 1970, Salazar was covering the Chicano moratorium, a major anti-Vietnam War demonstration. After the largely peaceful protests, Salazar retired with his crew to the $1 Cafe, a local East Los Angeles bar. Reports of an armed disturbance sent deputies to the scene, including one who shot a tear gas projectile into the bar that hit and killed Salazar instantly. No one was ever prosecuted for the killing. Salazar immediately became a martyr, memorialized in posters, prints, exhibitions, and even corridos. Romero's monumental Death of Ruben Salazar does not transcribe the events of August 29, 1970, so much as offer his perspective on the incident's historic significance. Here, Romero collapses several moments in time to posit the experience of injustice as a defining element of Chicano identity. In the center mid-ground, 5 deputies with firearms march in unison toward the bar, as one of them shoots ammunition that explodes on the roof. To the left, a money exchange store named in part Casa de Cambio offers a Spanish language pun, literally translated into the House of Change. It calls attention to the ultimate objective of the moratorium, Salazar's writing, and the continued activism since his death. The nude women painted on the bar's facade refine the imagery that actually decorated the exterior of the silver dollar. Romero presents the Boulevard Theater adjacent to the bar, even though it was located several blocks away. The marquee announces a fictional Spanish-language film, La Muerte de Rubén Salazar, suggesting that the event will be memorialized in the future. Two vintage lowriders parading down the street hark back to the 1940s, the era of the infamous Zoot Suit riots that saw many incidents of public and police brutality against Chicanos in Los Angeles. Even as Romero's painting undoubtedly recalls both Mexican and Chicano muralism, its narrative subject and large scale also link it to the tradition of history painting that reflects upon pivotal events that shaped American history. While Latino artists routinely engage American history, they are even more drawn to popular culture as a source and sign of the changing nature of American life. It is important to point out that many Latino artists came of age during and after the heyday of pop art, and like their peers, they too turned their attention to media and consumer culture. Yet for Latino artists, the popular connoted much more than the tried and true symbols of the USA. Rather, they embraced a broad sweep of popular references and approaches, from interventions in the media and public space to vernacular immigrant traditions and imported icons. Like African American artists such as Joe Overstreet, who challenged stereotypes like the Mammy, Latino artists also gravitated to the intersection of race and American consumer culture. Disparaging representations of Latinos and Latin Americans had long been part of American popular culture, especially films, which featured Mexican banditos and over-the-top characters like Carmen Miranda's Brazilian Bombshell. Since the 1940s, American corporations such as Frito-Lay and Chiquita brands echoed these representations in their advertising and product packaging for Latino-related foodstuffs like corn chips and bananas. In the early 1970s, at the same time that Chicano activists were lobbying to remove the Frito Bandito from public circulation, Mel Casas placed the stereotypic mascot for Frito-Lay corn chips as a centerpiece of his Humanscape 62. In fact, it was this promotional giveaway, a green Frito Bandito pencil eraser, that inspired Casas' painting. In the mid-1960s, Mel Casas initiated his Humanscape series as a means to explore the psychological impact of mass media images. The series was instigated by the artist's surreal encounter with the drive-in movie screen, a source suggested by the large central screen image found in each Humanscape installment. In number 62, Casas united a series of trivialized and meaningful brown references drawn from American and indigenous cultures. On the left, right, and center, Casas depicts a stoic Native American presented in profile, a group of unassuming Native or Mexican American women wearing textiles, and a junior Girl Scout or brownie. Near the center foreground, in front of a double-headed serpent, a green-colored Frito Bandito modeled after the eraser rides the shoulders of a skeleton. These latter figures refer to actual Mesoamerican objects. The double-headed snake represents the Aztec deity Quetzalcoatl and is based on a jade pendant in the collection of the British Museum. And the skeletal figure resembles a green stone statuette in a German collection that represents Xolote, the deformed twin of Quetzalcoatl. Such incongruent juxtapositions simultaneously critique the trivialization of Chicano and indigenous culture and allude to the rich culture's stereotypes obscure. Casas was not alone in debunking stereotypes through ironic juxtaposition. In 2002, Adal created a sculpture and video that literally deconstructs West Side Story, the classic 1961 film that widely introduced Puerto Ricans into American popular culture. West Side Story was set in New York City among rival Puerto Rican and white ethnic gangs. The film presented Puerto Rican characters as criminals and spitfires, all the while superficially treating the poverty that spurred islanders' migration to the mainland. The video, which is embedded in a suitcase, interweaves distorted, blurred, and upside-down film clips from West Side Story with documentary photos of Puerto Rican migrants, pointed quotations by the Nuyorican poet Pedro Pietri, and footage of mambo dancers in New York City. Adal's carefully constructed montage uncovers how West Side Story was not only inspired by the explosion of Puerto Rican migration, but also indebted to the Latino jazz and mambo boom centered in New York's Palladium Ballroom. For other artists, the straightforward act of documenting Latino life served to challenge media stereotypes. Sophie Rivera used her camera to capture glimpses of the Puerto Rican community in New York at a time when critics and activists spoke out against the book and later film Fort Apache, the Bronx. In her two untitled portraits feature Puerto Ricans who traversed New York City. Rivera sought out her subjects by standing outside her building and asking passersby if they were Puerto Rican. If they answered yes, she invited them to her studio and photographed them against a wood panel background. Her large-scale, I'm sorry, I'm a little out of order. Her large-scale photographs, each is 4 feet square, capture dignified, yet unsentimental glimpses of her sitters. In one picture, a man looks slightly pale and weathered. Barely visible under the collar of his shirt is a beaded necklace that suggests he may be a practitioner of Santeria, an Afro-Caribbean faith. In another, a young woman has carefully styled her hair after Farrah Fawcett's famed feathered hairdo. She wears a smock and perhaps may be a hairdresser or work at a local supermarket. Unlike traditional portraits, which often identify sitters by name, Rivera's subjects remain anonymous, even to her. By visually revealing her subjects in great detail and simplicity, yet leaving them unnamed, Rivera invites viewers to reach their own conclusions about who these individuals are. Looking to the everyday allowed artists to discover the aesthetic possibilities rooted in Latino life. Artists like Amalia Mesa Baines retooled vernacular Chicano traditions like altar making. Mesa Baines started creating commemorative altars and offerings born out of her study of Day of the Dead and devotional traditions cultivated by women. Some of her altar installations, like An Ofrenda for Dolores del Rio, seen here, pay tribute to historical figures such as Del Rio, the golden age movie star who appeared in more than 50 films in Hollywood and Mexico before her death in 1983, a year before Mesa Baines created this work. The altar installation takes the form of a chapel-scaled altar and also resembles a woman's vanity table, whose elements are placed in a niche draped in billowing pink fabric. For Mesa Baines, Del Rio was a strong female figure with which she and other Chicanas could identify, and also a vehicle for her own meditation on beauty and aging. The artist's ample use of mirrors at the bottom tiers of the installation implies these multifaceted dimensions. The mirrors represent both female beauty rituals and the self-affirming effect of Chicanas seeing a movie star that resembles them. Mesa Baines' affirmation that Chicana domestic practices like altar making are a valid form of art making parallels the efforts of feminist artists such as Miriam Shapiro, who reclaimed the form of women's domestic arts like quilt making as the basis for their own work. Miguel Luciano, on the other hand, has focused on how the meaning of imported symbols can morph in a new context. His Pure Plantainum series, which consists of sculptures and photography, was born from his interest in an icon that first appeared in colonial Puerto Rican art. Luciano is aware that plantains have long signified Puerto Rican and Caribbean cultural identity and political sovereignty. Beyond that, he is also interested in the plantain's popular associations to race, class, and masculinity, and how these meanings play themselves out in the United States. Caribbean popular expressions often link the plantain's phallic shape with virility, and the stains which the fruit can leave on hands and clothes of those who handle them often stand as a disparaging metaphor for the stain of blackness. Luciano observed that for Latino youth in the United States, the plantain functions like a valued badge of pride, an emblem that proudly announces their cultural roots in the face of social marginalization. This pointed shift in meaning is implied by the plantain's bejeweled external appearance, but also by what its sparkling shell contains, a decomposing real plantain within. By fashioning an object that assumes the bling-bling guise of hip-hop culture, where platinum jewelry is a sought-after commodity, Luciano further calls attention to the ways in which Latinos continue to shape this vibrant form of American popular culture. For these and other reasons, Luciano's consumerist fantasy, which heightens the resonance of Latino popular culture, is nuanced in a different way than Jeff Koons' iconic stainless steel rabbit, a work that comments on the excesses of 1980s consumerism. Our America showcases that the forms through which artists engage imported cultural tradition can range from the representational to the abstract. Freddie Rodriguez, who emigrated to the United States from the Dominican Republic in 1963, created these syncopated, non-objective works to evoke the pulse of Latino music. Arriving at the youthful age of 18, Rodriguez studied art in New York, where he was drawn to Mondrian's jazz-inspired works and the shaped geometric canvases of younger artists like Frank Stella. Painted in the early 1970s, when hard-edged minimalist paintings thrived in New York City, these three paintings were created during a time when Caribbean migrants birthed salsa, a musical form born from primarily Cuban-based rhythms, and that was recorded by new record labels like Fania. What is striking about these paintings is their intense physicality, evoked by the titles such as Danza Africana, that refer to dance. At 8 feet tall, these slender paintings are close to life size, and their crisscrossing lines suggest the movement of dancing couples. One of the canvases even depicts fleshy colors like pink and dark beige. These works affirm that the strong African foundation of Caribbean music, and also communicate that some musical traditions are not simply meant to be heard, but experienced through the body. I want to end my talk with the work that I believe embodies the multidimensional goals of our America. Maria's Great Expedition was created by Cristina Fernandez and relays the life story of Maria Gonzalez, the artist's great-grandmother and the first member of her family to migrate from Mexico to the United States. To construct her story, the artist interviewed relatives, studied American and Mexican history, and photographed herself assuming the guise of her great-grandmother at key moments in her life. The final presentation takes the form of a museum installation about the discovery and settlement of North America. It includes a map outlining Maria's movement from Mexico through several southwestern states, imagined photographs of Maria, as well as a detailed written narrative that interweaves fragments from her life within a larger view of American history from 1910 to 1950. Each photograph and accompanying text reveals how Mexican Americans helped build the American West. The first installment in the story, titled 1910, Leaving Morelia, ties Maria's decision to migrate to the unrest caused by the Mexican Revolution and the growing demands for cheap labor in the United States. The related photograph portrays a young woman looking outside the picture plane, as if she were contemplating the future. In Colorado, we learned that Maria supported her growing family by providing food and lodging to European immigrant miners. By the time Maria moves to Boyle Heights in Los Angeles in the 1940s, we learned that her sons participated in the World War II effort, and that Mexican American and African American workers filled labor shortages caused by the internment of Japanese Americans and rising military enlistments. Maria's individual yet complex story offers a remarkable picture of the overlapping relationships between national and group histories. Like the larger spirit that propels our America, Maria's Great Expedition marks a deep historical presence and exposes the absences in our national imaginary. It reveals these absences by offering clues that it is a present-day intervention in the historical past. The protagonist, who is impersonated by the artist, never ages over her 40-year history. Some pictures are sprinkled with present-day references, like a 99-cent store flyers we very much associate with our contemporary culture. Most significantly, each picture takes on the shifting photographic conventions of 20th century American photography. The picture of 1930 transporting produce, for example, looks like a period photograph that documents the lives of struggling Americans during the Depression. These self-reflective strategies not only allow Fernandez to pointedly insert Mexican-American history where it has been left out, they also convey that all histories, whether familial, group, or national, are constructed. The need to document this history as late as 1996, when Fernandez completed the project, speaks to the work that remains to be done to construct a fuller picture of the American experience. I hope that the exhibition, Our America, allows our viewers to understand that the American experience we so often conjure is not comprised of a single narrative, but a series of stories and perspectives that can exist simultaneously or in tension with one another. Our Latino collection invites and challenges our visitors to ponder the Latino American experience as made manifest by artists who have long been active participants in the history of American art. Now that Our America is a reality, or as I like to call it, an artifact, the question remains, what impact will its ideas have on the discussion of Latino art? In many ways, a debate ensued immediately after the show opened, when Philip Kennicott, an art critic for the Washington Post, wrote a review of the exhibition, which stirred so much discussion on Facebook that a companion published conversation between Kennicott and filmmaker Alex Rivera was presented in an article on the Post style blog. One can describe Kennicott's perspective on the exhibition in a number of ways. He questioned the viability of Latino art, describing it as a meaningless category. He critiqued the existence of culturally specific exhibitions. And he offered what I consider historically inaccurate assessments of works in the show, arguing, for example, that the abstract paintings displayed were simply second-rate knockoffs. My main critique of Kennicott's review is that he did not engage any of the ideas that I've mapped out in this lecture, which are articulated in the exhibition's extensive signage and catalog. What does it mean to consider Latino artists as American artists? And how does their production shape and inform the way we think about our national culture? Had Kennicott engaged these basic questions and offered an assessment of the exhibition's success or failure at framing these larger issues, I would have respected his critical response. The question therefore remains, is the critical establishment able to approach Latino art as American art? We'll have to wait and see what other responses this show instigates when it begins its 3-year tour to over 6 cities across the United States. Thank you.
All right, we have time for questions, comments.
Yes.
How did you set about to choosing the pieces that were going to be in this exhibit? What kinds of organizing ideas did you have going into it? I'm not an art historian, so I really have no idea, and I'm kind of intrigued because there's so many themes running through it besides just cultural representation and historical. So I'm just curious what some of that process might have looked like.
I think it started out really historically, and thinking about, well, when does Latino art become a thing, right? As I state in my lecture, Latino art doesn't start around the Civil Rights era, right? It doesn't call itself that, but it's existed, in this country. But I was really interested in kind of tracing the development of Latino art as it emerges as such. When artists started to identify themselves as Latino and started, you saw spaces and discussions and debates. So that sort of really shaped, what I was trying to do. I was very interested really in mapping out this question of what is the relationship between Latino art and American art. So that provided another filter and lens through which to look at this work. And my interest in kind of developing this, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm looking for a word that's not coming to me. Of looking at the sort of origins of the field already took me to the mid-century, right? So I can sort of, I'm not going to focus on what came before, but really looking at this mid-century period, and then thinking about these key national themes that we consider are very American. So, Western expansion, the notion that we're, immigrants, the idea that our popular culture says something about, who we are as a nation and our uniqueness. So all of these things kind of emerged also from the work itself. This is what I was seeing. I was very interested in really presenting Latino art as a valid category. And part of that entailed revealing how there are certain themes that cut across artists of different generations, of different regions. So when you visit the exhibition, you'll see that there's work by an artist working in Los Angeles who didn't know that there's other artists in New York doing something very similar, right? So really my goal was to establish this kind of conversation between Latino artists working at different times and in different parts of the country. I was obviously very interested in making sure that our collection reflected the diversity of the Latino community. The collection that I inherited was heavily Mexican American. So I needed to really focus and shore up our collection of Puerto Rican art, for example, and other works by other artists from other communities. So that also informed many of my choices. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh, actually, I have a related question. Is it a question related to Jackie? Okay, because actually you already answered my question in a way, but because I was interested in what is the criteria. All of the artifacts and the pieces you showed here belong to except those that were clearly labeled as not belonging to the American Art Museum, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering what is the criteria that the museum follows to collect Latino art, and you are the person that shapes the guidelines of that criteria, or and is there a criteria or anything that you consider of quality and?
We don't really have a policy like, okay, an artwork has to do X, Y, and Z. We look at it on the basis of, its artistic merit. Our collection is largely composed of works by established artists. So these are artists who have, a track record. We tend not to show works by emerging artists, for example. So there's no criteria outside of the fact that, I have to make an argument for why this is important. And that's what I had to do when I acquired each of these works. Each of these works required an argument. This is important because of X, Y, and Z. In many cases, establishing a connection between these artists and sort of these larger movements or larger issues within American art or American culture or Latino culture. So yeah, it's not a clear criteria. I think we are, however, a museum of the art of the United States. That's a major point. So I remember when I gave this talk and someone said, well, where is Diego Rivera? Well, Diego Rivera is not an American artist, Frida Kahlo is not an American artist. This is not an exhibition of the art of the Americas. This is an exhibition of work by artists who are, citizens, residents, or artists, international artists who've had a significant presence in the United States. So that's a major criteria, and one that I appreciate because I think many Latino artists, fall between the cracks in museum collections and exhibitions, right? They're not really Latin American, they're not considered as American, so then no one represents them. So the fact that we have this museum that's really focused on the art of the United States allows me to really kind of focus on their contribution. Yes?
Then I guess going off of that,
Yes.
I have kind of a couple related but unrelated questions.
Yes.
You just said that this is American art, right? So that's a signifier that could take so many connotations, right? And from the Latin American side, we want to think of America, toda la America, right?
Right.
But more, I guess, I'm kind of thinking the name of the exhibition, Our America, Nuestra América from José Martí.
Yes.
And that kind of involves that definition or idea, Our America, right? So I'm wondering, I understand that it's U.S. America,
Yes.
but if you can talk about the notions of Latinidad, then the curation of these pieces generates, I would want to think that it's multiple definitions or ideas of Latinidad. So,
Well, just
I don't know if I'm making sense, but
not entirely, but let me try. The title of the exhibition is a reference to José Martí, but it's more a reference to the fact that he wrote that essay in New York City, right? And in fact, many Latino scholars are beginning to look at that as, and you may be familiar with that essay. It's kind of like a significant essay that begins to sort of articulate this pan-Latin American consciousness. So many Latino scholars are looking at that as, okay, the idea of Latino is trying to do something similar, right? It's trying to present, this unified view of all these Latin American immigrants, imported populations that are in the United States. So that's the direction that I'm approaching Martí in. I'm less really talking about, the Americas, but really kind of looking at that essay, at the critical stance of this essay as almost like he's Latino. And some Latino scholars are beginning to say, well, you know what? Actually, Martí had a Latino phase, and we can look at his kind of critical posture to the United States as a kind of burgeoning perspective on what Latinos do, right? Which we offer a kind of critical perspective on life in this country. So that's the way that I was sort of using Martí. And I guess your question of Latinidad, I'm not suggesting, that there are not connections between Latino art and Latin America. Absolutely not. I think there have been more exhibitions that have focused on that, and we sort of need to look at the other side. And that's what I feel that our museum, which is dedicated to the art of the United States, can do. And that's why I felt that this approach and this sort of thesis of this exhibition was very appropriate. But it's not a totalizing view. I think that there are many other perspectives. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
It was actually about the title. I was wondering, what it has to do with José Martí. How
Yeah.
you're trying to relate them.
Yeah, I mean, it does have to do with José Martí. I think it also has to do, I liked the ownership that phrase conveyed, right? It's sort of like, we're not foreigners, this is our America too. We're claiming this. We belong here, we're part of this history, this is our America just as much as it's anyone else's America. So it kind of operated on a number of levels. There was the historical reference, but there's also just the basic ownership of the phrase. Yes. Yes.
I also, I know that you touched on this review here. Have you gotten other feedback, other reviews regarding the exhibition?
At our museum, reviews by our critics are the most important in many ways. I mean, that's sort of, how we, in many ways, judge the success or lack of success of the message that we send out in part. We've gotten a lot of very favorable reviews from the general press, and we've gotten excellent reviews from our audience. I think it was, and this is really complex, and I encourage you to go to the Washington Post and sort of read the debate and see what you all think But it was a very problematic review because he simply didn't engage the ideas of the exhibition. He was very much focused on the. If you read the review, it appears as if I took a selection of our works and just threw them in a gallery and said, this is Latino art. That's it. And not offered a kind of historical, or cultural map for trying to engage these works. So that was kind of like my main criticism with the piece, was that he actually didn't engage the ideas of the exhibition.
And is that what he meant by when he said, you mentioned before that one of his criticism was that the category Latino art is meaningless, in the sense that there is no such a thing as Latino art or Italian American art or Irish American art, or he meant that it was incoherent. What did he? Can you elaborate on what he meant by that?
Well, trying to get into his head, I think that he meant that, he didn't like that there were so many diverse things in the exhibition, right? That you can go from posters to abstract art. He would have preferred that the exhibition focused on a single group or a single sort of subject, which again, he doesn't really know about the history of Latino exhibitions. He's very unfamiliar with. So there are many exhibitions that have actually already done that. So I didn't want to repeat that. And this is an exhibition of a permanent collection, right? Which by its nature is meant to define a field, and I was not about to define this field, very narrowly. And I think that the challenge with the way that the article discusses the problem of Latino art is that, we, and I say we because he's referring to the catalog essays, and there was another scholar who wrote the introduction, that we present a very broad, definition of Latino art. We're not, I'm not making a stylistic argument. I'm not saying, well, Latino artists always do this, or they always do this. I was not about to do that because that's not the reality of Latino art. That's not the reality of any art, frankly, right? But he failed to understand that, and he accepts that range for American art. He accepts all these other but when you come to Latino art, they want you to be like in a box. So I guess that's why he thought it was sort of a meaningless category, because it was too diverse. It was kind of he described it as a mess.
And is this guy like well-known, important art critic, or just?
He's an important art critic. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his art criticism. But when you read the article, it's very, very hostile. It actually didn't quite surprise me, but he's very hostile about the exhibition. And it's clear that he has issues with the Smithsonian, right? That he's sort of not happy with the direction that the Smithsonian is leading in. So there was a kind of subtext about the larger institution of which this exhibition is part.
It seems like this can't be the first time that someone is questioning the idea of Latino art as a meaningful category and wanting to do sort of more old school rather than postmodern approaches, that this must have happened in other parts of the country.
Well,
with the certain types of old school art critics who aren't familiar with the field to be writing a very similar type of critique.
Well, the review was essentially a broken record.
Okay.
If you look at, and I also studied African American art, and when you look at the critical response to African American art in the 1970s, when you had the first series of major exhibitions, it was the same response. Oh, they're derivative. What does this mean? And it's the same kind of feedback. So I think, and recently, in fact, there have been a lot of instances like this, There was an exhibition presented originally in Los Angeles, and it received very good feedback in Los Angeles, and then it was presented in New York. And a New York Times critic also wrote a very ignorant response to it, and artists was just like, I mean, there was a petition and there was a lot of like activity around it. So I think that, you know, we speak about diversifying a lot of different professions, and it's clear that the field of art criticism also needs to be diversified in many ways, at least in ways of thinking, right? And in knowledge about non-mainstream artists. You know, I think that there's a kind of a critical vacuum there in terms of knowledge base that really hampers these critics from engaging this work in an informed way.
So they
You
need
know,
to be
I mean,
educated.
I was really offended by the fact that he refers to the abstract artist as second-rate artists. And part of the reason for including an early work by Carmen Herrera was to show that, in fact, she wasn't derivative. She's working at the same time as all these other artists, right? So there was this kind of this real fine-tuned nature of the exhibition that he didn't quite get, and it's a double standard. Again, it's a double standard. You know, because we don't call Gene Davis derivative because he made strip paintings after Frank Stella. But that Freddie Rodriguez, he's derivative. Okay, let's call him derivative. So there's a real kind of double standard, you know, going on.
So it seems to me that you're fulfilling the educational mission of the Smithsonian, even by talking about this. My comment that I was going to make before is that I love the fact that you included this critique as part of your presentation.
Yeah.
And this debate, really. And I think, you know, for anyone who goes to see the exhibit, is there something about this there, or
no,
would one
there-
have
there-
to go online?
Yeah, they'll have to go online, but this review, because of the debate that it ensued, this review is permanently linked to the exhibition. Like, there are so many people that I meet, they're like, oh yeah, I read that review. Oh yeah, I read that. It's like that, his review, more so that than this. You know, more so the original review than the response to the debate that it ensued. But it has, you know, it's part of the cultural artifact, which is this exhibition. And we'll see the kind of the impact that it has in the future and when it's presented in other parts of the country. Yes?
It's kind of interesting because I do Latino lit, right? So
Yeah.
for the boom in the 90s, right, Cristina Garcia and Julia Alvarez,
Mhm.
you know, there was also a somewhat similar critique, but a good reception of that work, right?
Mhm.
But there was a tendency to also call it derivative, but from the Latin American side, right?
Right.
Oh, it has magical realism. So
Mhm.
in a North American or U.S. reception, you know, that kind of signified good, right? Because
Right.
it was linked to that previous boom.
Mhm.
But this idea of the derivative, right, a copy and not good enough and not original enough, you know, is kind of, you know, hurled at, you know, avant-garde and so forth, right?
Right, uh-huh.
So there's a pattern of this, right, that maybe we
Absolutely.
can trace the genealogy going way back, and you mentioned African American art, right?
Well, to colonial art. I mean,
To
we can go
colonial.
back to colonial art in the Americas. You know,
Mhm.
that's the way that it was presented. It's derivative as opposed to kind of understanding it within its own cultural context.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, that's a really good point because
Mhm.
it reminds me now that like criticism I heard of some Jonathan Brown, the great historian of
Spanish
golden
art,
age
right,
Spanish
right.
art. He recently, or not so recently anymore, but some years ago decided to move to study the art being produced in the Americas in the colonial period.
Mhm.
And I remember that one of the criticisms that he had to deal with is that there was nothing, it was like going down or degrading himself because
Mhm.
of the art being produced there in the Baroque period. The Baroque art of the Americas was derivative of,
Mhm.
of even low quality or so, and people couldn't understand how somebody who was the greatest expert on Velázquez could go and look at this
Yeah.
kind of so that derivative thing has been around forever, and and you can go back all the way down to the colonial period.
Yeah, and I think a key word for this exhibition is participation, right? These artists are participating in the national culture, you know, I'm not putting them on a secondary tier. They're peers, they're participants, and that was, you know, the goal of this exhibition, is to elucidate that, is to reveal what those connections are.
And and whether Kennicott or any other critics had, or in your experience as a curator of Latino art, have you ever been criticized for collecting Latino art which is not sufficiently Latino, or that's not the opposite?
I mean, that's what I brought to the table when I came on board. You know, I think our collection prior to my joining the museum was very culturally specific. It was very much linked to like the civil rights movement, and which is very important and is a major part of it. But that's not the only production of Latino artists. So I came on board really wanting to show the vast aesthetic range of this work. That was top on my priority list, because that's the reality of the field. That is the reality of the field. Okay, any other questions?
No? Well, then we can thank you very much
Okay,
again,
thank
Carmen,
you.
for your
Thank you for inviting
excellent
me.
presentation.